Welcome to the excavations near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was built first in the First Temple period, in the time of King Solomon, according to the Bible, but we don't have too much from that time remaining in this area because Jerusalem was destroyed and rebuilt many times since then. Later, in the year 586 BC, the temple built by King Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. So that was the end of the First Temple period. A couple of decades later, in the year 538, the Persian king Cyrus takes over the Babylonian kingdom, and basically he becomes the boss in this region. And he allows the Jews to come back to their land, to Judah, to Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. It takes them a while, about 20 years, until the temple is indeed built in the year 515 BC. And since then, it's the beginning of the Second Temple period. The temple was inside a large compound, which isn't as big as it is today. Today, it's 144,000 square meters. It's huge. But in the return to Zion, in the Persian era, the temple was much smaller, and the Temple Mount, the compound on top of which the temple stood, was much smaller than it is today. Over the years, in the Hasmonean period, the temple was renovated, and the Temple Mount was also enlarged a little bit. By the time of King Herod the Great's ascension to the throne, in the year 37 BC, the Temple Mount was about 70,000 square meters, which is quite large, but not as impressive as it is today. King Herod decides to build things on a much grander scale. And he firstly builds the Temple Mount, which is basically 4 large walls that we call the walls of the Temple Mount. One of them is the Western Wall, where Jews come to pray till this day. And on top, he destroys and rebuilds the temple. So King Herod makes the Temple Mount the grand scale platform that we see today, which is the largest platform, religious platform, in the Roman period, all over the world. It's the biggest one. As King Herod destroyed and rebuilt the temple, it means that technically King Herod's temple should be named the Third Temple. But actually, no one uses that title. Why? There's a good reason for that. The temple physically was destroyed by King Herod to rebuild a bigger, grander scale temple. But even though the physical stones were demolished and rebuilt, so it's technically the Third Temple, the significance of the temple is not the stones. The inner significance is the worship of the God of Israel. And that continued uninterrupted during the time of the rebuilding by King Herod. So yes, technically King Herod's temple is the Third Temple, but in fact, it is a continuation of the Second Temple when you look at the essence, which is the worship, the sacrifices, and so on. So King Herod's temple is still the Second Temple, but it's much more impressive than the temple we've known until then. Jesus, like any other Jew at the end of the Second Temple period, goes to the temple at least 3 times a year. Every Jew must go to the temple on the 3 major holidays, the 3 major festivities. On Pesach, Passover, later, 50 years later, on Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, and on Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. These are the 3 major feasts, and every Jew must go to the temple on these occasions. Jesus' family, Jesus himself, will come to Jerusalem. We don't know how many times, but they will come to Jerusalem, and they will make a pilgrimage to the temple to offer the sacrifices and to worship the God of Israel. One may, of course, ask, when Jesus came to Jerusalem, when he came to the temple, through which gate did he enter the temple? Now, we do know, judging by archaeology and the historical sources, that there were several entrances to the Temple Mount. There were entrances in the south. This is where we're standing. There were entrances in the west, in the north, and in the east. So which way would most people, most pilgrims go in order to get into the Temple Mount in the time of Jesus? We think we know. Let me take you there. I'm standing here now, south of the Temple Mount. Behind me, you can actually see some of the remains of the southern wall of the temple from the Second Temple period. Though most of what we see here of the wall, the top parts of the wall are actually from later periods, the foundations are still there, and I'm going to show it to you in a moment. Anyhow, before we discuss the question of which way did Jesus come to the temple in the Second Temple period, the other question that bothers me too, what was actually the attitude of Jesus to the temple? Now, many people believe, and I think this is a mistake, that Jesus was anti-temple, was against the temple as a concept. But actually, the situation is more complex. Yes, there were Jews in the Second Temple period who did not accept the idea of the temple in Jerusalem, who refused to make pilgrimage to the temple. For instance, some of the Essenians, the people who lived in the desert next to the Dead Sea, Qumran, some of them, yes, they rejected the whole idea of the temple. They perceived the temple as being impure, for different reasons. So there is a small group of people who are anti-temple in their ideology. But in the case of Jesus, as I said, it's different. Yes, we hear about Jesus coming in Hanukkah, which is one of the festivals, the Jewish festivals already celebrated in the Second Temple period. He comes to the temple and he argues with the rabbis, with the Pharisees. Okay. We also hear about him coming to the temple and overturning the tables of the money changers. And he criticizes the fact that there's cattle and sheep on the temple. And he says, this is not an appropriate thing to do here. It sounds like he's very critical. But when you look at the facts in the New Testament, it's quite clear that he is very critical. But his critic is against the practices about what happens in the temple, about the administration, about how things are done on the Temple Mount. He believes that the way the temple is run is inappropriate. But he doesn't go against the idea of the temple of the God of Israel as a sanctuary for the Jewish people. It is quite clear when you look at the stories in the New Testament. Jesus' family brings him to the temple when he's a young boy. He visits the temple later in his life. He makes pilgrimage to the temple during the holidays. We are hearing about Jesus coming to the temple in the last week of his life, teaching at the temple. So obviously Jesus was a religious Jew, an Orthodox Jew, who believed that the temple is at the heart of Jerusalem, the heart of the Jewish people. But he went against, as I said, the practices, the malpractice of how the temple was run by the Pharisees, by the rabbis. It is quite clear from the scriptures. One of the stories we mentioned about Jesus raises the question of whether his criticism was actually justified. As I said, it is a moral criticism. So he criticizes the fact that there are money changers on the Temple Mount. Why are there money changers on the Temple Mount? Who needs money changers on the Temple Mount? Is it a business? Why sheep? Why cattle? It sounds very odd, unless we understand the sociological background of the Jewish people at the time. When I spoke about Jesus' attitude to what happens on the temple, I mentioned the famous event when he goes to the temple on a pilgrimage and he overturns the tables of the money changers and he speaks about the fact that there's sheep and cattle on the Temple Mount. What's the point in all that? What is the situation? How can we understand the fact that there are money changers on the Temple Mount or sheep going around here and there? Is this a ranch? Is it a bank? Why do we need all that? It sounds very peculiar until one understands the background. Think, for instance, about the visit of an average pilgrim to the temple in the Second Temple period. According to the Jewish law, he has to bring to the temple a tribute, an annual tribute of half shekel. Shekel is a type of currency, like the nowadays dollar, and every pilgrim has to bring half a shekel to the temple as a tribute, as a gift, every year. Now, according to the Jewish law, the shekel had to be a Tyrian shekel, meaning a shekel minted in the city of Tyre, which is in present-day Lebanon. However, when one comes from Egypt or from Mesopotamia, Iraq, present-day Iraq, where would he get shekels from? He brings his own currency back from home. So when he goes to the temple, he has to change the currency he has into the acceptable tribute of half a shekel. Where does he do that? Well, obviously, it was done on the Temple Mount. When a pilgrim comes, he has to bring an offering, a sacrifice. Do you take your lamb from the Galilee? Well, maybe that's possible. But would you bring a lamb from Egypt? It would probably die along the way. It would be more appropriate to have lamb sellers, okay, people who trade, people who sell the cattle or the sheep to the pilgrims right here in Jerusalem. So that was also sold to the pilgrims on the Temple Mount. Mind you, it's the Temple Mount, not the temple. The temple is not the place where you have money changers. The Temple Mount is the compound around. Think about the size. The temple is about 50 meters high, 50 meters long. That's it. The Temple Mount, well, it is surrounded by 500-meter long walls. Some of them are shorter, 280 meters long. But generally, it's a huge compound. So buying and selling the animals and changing the money isn't actually done on the temple itself. It's done on the Temple Mount, outside the temple. But for Jesus, and this is the unique thing, unlike the other Jews who think that's fine, selling and buying on the temple for the purpose of sacrifices, for the purpose of worship of the Lord of Israel, in the eyes of Jesus, things are different. He thinks that the sanctity of the building of the temple applies also to the compound around. From that perspective, he cannot accept selling and buying the animals or changing money on the Temple Mount. The excavations here, next to the southern wall of the Temple Mount from the Second Temple period, began immediately after the Six-Day War in 1967. And one of the greatest and most surprising things found in this excavation was this huge staircase. I'm actually standing here on stairs dating from the Second Temple period. And it's not just that little step I'm standing on, it's the entire staircase behind me. Now that was a great surprise. I'll tell you why. Such a huge staircase was not found anywhere around the temple from the Second Temple period. It means that this must have been the main entranceway to the temple during the Second Temple period. This may have been also the way Jesus took in order to get into the temple. But if you look carefully at the staircase, you can see that there's something very unique in it, something that we find in other staircases from the Second Temple period, but never before or after. Take a look, a good look at the stairs. I'm standing on a wide stair, and then a narrow one, and a wide one, and a narrow and wide, narrow and wide. It's very odd. You don't build staircase this way. So the question is, why is it built like that? We don't really know, but archaeologists have suggested that perhaps the reason has to do with the way in and out from the temple. Think about getting into the temple in the Second Temple period, 2,000 years ago in the time of Jesus. When you go up, you climb slowly, reverently. You don't run. But when the service is over, when the sacrifices were offered, you leave the temple, you go home, you're thirsty, you're hungry, you want to go home as fast as possible. So what do? You run out. To prevent that, they built and designed these stairs in such a way that you have to make sure you don't fall down when you walk on them. So you walk slowly. Maybe that's the reason for the odd shape of the staircase. Now, obviously, if there's a staircase, there must be a gate. Do we see any gate here in the southern wall of the Temple Mount? Well, if you look carefully, you can clearly see it for yourselves. Look at the arch attached to the wall. The arch is not from the Second Temple period. It is from the 7th century, probably. It was built by the early Muslims who occupied Jerusalem in the year 638. But below the arch, you can see small stones, and to the right, a nice line of large stones. It means that what we have here is a blocked gate. There was a gate, there was an entrance here to the temple, someone decided to block it 100 years later than the Second Temple period. The gate here is actually a double gate, meaning it has two entrances. The reason that you don't see that is very simple. To the left, there's a building here that covers half of the gate, so you don't see much. Now, is this the only entranceway to the temple? Well, there's another one. Look over there, still in the southern wall. You can clearly see the imprint of 3 large arches. The way that gate, which is also blocked, the way it looks today is quite late. It is from the Muslim era, from the 7th century, maybe later. But originally, there used to be there a similar gate to this one. Maybe it had 3 entrances, maybe it had 2 entrances. Historians and archaeologists disagree about that. So we have here 2 entrances, 2 gates leading to the temple from the Second Temple period. Why do we need 2 of them? Well, the Hebrew sources from the time of the rabbis tell us that the reason was 1 gate was used for entry, the other one as an exit. How do you do that? You walk into the temple through the triple gate, the 3 arches. You go around doing your business inside, sacrificing, praying, whatever you want, and then you go out. You don't go out the same way. You go out through this one. This gate is the exit. What is the significance of that? Apart from a better administration of the sites, controlling the movement of multitudes of people inside. It makes sense to do it this way. But there's an inner theological, spiritual, sociological reason behind it. According to the sages, the Jewish sages, everyone gets into the temple on the right-hand side and goes out on the left-hand side except for some people, such as people who are mourning. They're in pain. They just lost a loved one, their father, their parents perhaps. They're mourning, they're in pain, they're suffering. Yet everyone else is happy. It's a festival, it's a holiday. People are coming to celebrate. No one knows what they feel inside. But the sages say, those people get in through the left-hand side gate, the double gate, and they come out through the entrance gate. It's the opposite. This way, people coming happily, celebrating, they look and they see someone going the opposite direction, and immediately they understand that something is wrong. He has to be comforted. So they come to him and they ask him or her, what happened? Share with us, tell us what happened. And he tells them, I lost my father, I lost my sister, and they comfort him. This is a beautiful sociological tool to bring people from different continents, from different places around the world, every Jew coming from a different place in the diaspora or from here, bringing them together. One beating heart of the Jewish people at the heart of Jerusalem, at the heart of the Jewish nation. And these things happen in the Second Temple period, in the time of Jesus. When the Magnificent Staircase from the Second Temple period was found in the late 60s and the beginning of the 1970s by the Israeli archaeologists who excavated here, led by the late Professor Binyamin Mazal, many visitors from abroad came to visit. Rumors about the entranceway to the temple that was found was published all over the world. And many dignitaries, VIPs of the time, came to visit the excavation. One of them was a gentleman named Neil Armstrong. Now, Armstrong, for those of you who don't know that, was the first man on the moon in 1969. And when he comes here, he's already a celebrity, obviously, a devout Christian. And he comes here, he looks around, and he is guided by the archaeologist. And during the explanation, he hears that this is the main entranceway to the temple from the time of Jesus. So he looks around and then he asks the archaeologist, tell me, is it possible that Jesus himself climbed over these stairs when he entered the temple? And the archaeologist looks around and he said, well, it's quite plausible. He was a Jew. He came many times to the temple. It's the right period. It's the end of the Second Temple period. It's the time of Jesus. Yes, he may have stood right here. And Neil Armstrong looks at him and he says, I am now more moved and excited than I was when I landed on the moon. I think that in one word, this shows us the importance of religion, of belief, and archaeology in the minds and hearts of people, regardless of whether they are Christians, Jews, or Muslims. People looking at that, they feel that they are part of the history of humanity. This is quite an exciting place, I think. Here, I'm standing on a street from the Second Temple period next to the Western Wall. This is actually the corner between the southern wall and the Western Wall. So this is the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And over here we can see a street which is paved by large stones. These are truly huge stones. And these stones hide underneath an underground passage, a drainage for rainwater. Think about it. When they built in Jerusalem in the Second Temple period, in the time of King Herod, the city did not have these kind of paved streets. So rainwater would be naturally absorbed by the ground. But once you build paved streets, the result is that there's no way for it to go. And as a result, what you get is an annual flooding. How do you do that? By leaving open places in the street, open holes that allow the water to be drained into the underground passage. The street leads from here to the south, to the city of David, but also to the north, to the northern gates of the Temple Mount. Until a couple of years ago, most scholars agreed that this street was built by King Herod. The main reasoning was that King Herod is the greatest builder in the Second Temple period. We have a large construction here. It must be Herodian. Does that sound convincing? Well, until recently, most scholars believed it is. But now the picture changes. Right underneath us, you can't see it from here, there's an ongoing excavation. We have found the foundations of the Western Wall. This is the Western Wall. Below us is the foundations, the lowest courses leaning on solid bedrock that holds them. In the bedrock, there are cavities, there are holes, and in there we have found coins. The coins underneath the Western Wall here are dating from around the year 20 AD. It means that the wall that is built on top must be later than the year 20 or from the year 20, but not before. Now, King Herod, the builder of the Temple Mount, he died in 4 BC. That's 25 years before this section of the wall was built. He couldn't have built it. So the wall, at least this section, perhaps dates from a generation after King Herod, from the beginning of the 1st century. The street, that's a great surprise. Under the street, we have other coins. And these coins are from the time of Pontius Pilatus. He was the Roman governor who crucified Jesus. It means that it couldn't have been built by King Herod. It's too late. The coins are from the year 30 AD and not -4. Therefore, the street was built 30 or 35 years after the time of King Herod. That's fascinating. Everything changes as we look at it. I always say, the future doesn't change. It didn't happen yet. The present is happening, so obviously it doesn't change. The only thing that changes is history, is archaeology. We thought this is Herodian. We thought this is Herodian. Now we understand there were other great builders than King Herod. So the street may have been constructed by perhaps Pontius Pilate. It means that in the time of Jesus, remember, Jesus was crucified, we believe, at around the year 30 or 33 AD. It means that during his lifetime, he would have witnessed the construction of this street and the construction of this section of the Western Wall. Mind you, I just want to make sure that we understand each other. This wall and the Temple Mount and the temple, they were built by King Herod. There's no doubt about that, because the Jewish historian of the Second Temple period, Josephus Flavius, he tells us that. The question is about this part of the Western Wall, about this part of the street. They are no longer Herodian, but the rest, yeah, it could be Herod's. Above our heads, right above me, in the 1st century, there was a huge arch. You can actually see the beginning of the arch coming out from the wall. Look up there and you can see the beginning of the arch. This arch went above my head and landed on this magnificent structure with four entrances. This structure is where the arch lies. And then, we now know, it jumps again, a smaller arch, and then a series of smaller arches until it reaches the level of the street. It means that what we see here is not a bridge going to the city over there. It is actually something else. It is an interchange. Just like in modern roads all over the world, you have flyovers, interchanges, leading you from one level to another. That's the purpose of this arch. This arch begins in this section of the Temple Mount, which was built later than the time of King Herod, according to the excavators here now. It means that the arch is also later than the time of King Herod, and maybe in the time of Jesus, they were in the midst of constructing it. That's what he would see. This arch is known as Robinson's Arch. Robinson is not a Jewish name. It's a name of an American scholar who noticed this beginning of an arch up here in the 1830s. That's almost 200 years ago. It's quite amazing. And as I said, we believed it's all Herodian. The arch, the street, this part of the Western Wall, and now we begin to doubt everything. We've all become doubting Thomases. We no longer believe this is Herodian. It's probably slightly later. But there's one thing that didn't change in our understanding of this area. Regardless of whoever built it, it is clear that everything you see here was destroyed on one day in the year 70 AD, when the Romans break into Jerusalem, set fire to the temple on the month of Av, and then destroy the entire city. That was the end of Jerusalem of the Second Temple period. And what you see around here are just a little portion of the destruction layer that the archaeologists have found when they dug here. All this street, all of that was covered with hundreds of tons of stones. They were taken out by the archaeologists to expose the passageway, the street. What was left here is this. You can see a series of walls. Again, everything is destroyed, but these are shops from the Second Temple period. In some of these shops, we can still find the coins the owners left when they ran out, when they fled the shop, when the Romans break into the city. So this is a real testimony to the last moments of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. So our conclusion is that the period of building of the Temple Mount and its surrounding was much, much longer than the lifetime of King Herod the Great. A nice indication to that comes from the New Testament. There's a nice story about Jesus standing before the Pharisees, the rabbis, and he tells them, if you destroy this temple, I will build it in 3 days. Now, we know from the continuation that Jesus refers to himself. He is the shrine, he is the temple, and that he will resurrect in 3 days. But when you read these verses, listen what the Pharisees answer to him. They say, how can you say such a thing? It took 46 years to build this temple, and you're boasting that you're going to build it in 3 days. So from that we hear about the length of time it took to build this magnificent building, which was one of the most impressive structures, impressive compounds in the entire Roman Empire. I'd like to take you now into one of the real shops from the Second Temple period. It is extremely well preserved because it is inside the foot of the Robinson's Arch. So here there are several shops, and I'm inside one of them, and you can clearly see something that indicates what was held here, because right here in the far back, there's a hole carved here. So you could actually insert a rope and tie an animal to it. So the question now is, remember the story about Jesus and the overturning of the tables of the money changers and his criticism against having animals in the temple? Could the New Testament actually refer to these shops? Or should we really assume that the story applies to the actual area that we call the Temple Mount today? Well, obviously, it sounds reasonable to assume that it was on the Temple Mount, right? Otherwise, why would Jesus be angered by the fact that they sell animals and they have money changers over there? But let me just suggest, maybe for Jesus, the sanctity of the temple did not end at the walls. We are next to the walls. Maybe in his concept, in his perception, the sanctity of the temple stretched over here too. In that case, maybe the entire story took place here. And you know what? Even if it didn't, it doesn't really matter. Even if it happened up there on the temple, this is how a real shop from the time of Jesus really looked like in the Second Temple period. So it does give us the atmosphere, the feel of the story in the New Testament. Roman historians 2,000 years ago, writing about Jerusalem, about the land of Israel, about the Jewish people, were always astounded by the fact that the Jewish people observe one day of the week and they refrain from work. This is, of course, the Shabbat. The idea behind it, the theological principle here, is that God stopped creating the world on the seventh day, and therefore we as humans basically imitate God. In Latin it's called imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. So Jews in the Second Temple period 2,000 years ago observed the Shabbat. We know that from the scriptures. But here we also have a direct evidence to that interesting fact. The stone I'm standing next to here is actually the cornerstone of the Temple Mount. Now, when we say today cornerstone, we refer to the stone at the base, at the foundations of a newly built building. But in this case, this is actually the top. This is the crown. It is a corner, and this is the original corner of the Temple Mount in the time of Jesus. It's quite fascinating. When the Romans destroyed the Temple Mount and they started to topple down the stones, throw them down, obviously they started with the top stones, and this one was one of the first to fall down over the street. But that's not the important thing here. The important thing here is the inscription that we see here. Now, this inscription here is a copy. It's a replica of the original, which is too important to be left here. It's in the Israel Museum nowadays. But it's an accurate copy, and it's in Hebrew script, in Hebrew characters, Hebrew letters. I can read it. Every young Israeli boy today who learned to read Hebrew can still read this inscription, even though it is 2,000 years old. It's quite amazing. And if you read it carefully, it says, Leveit hatekiah leha, to the house of trumpeting to what, you may ask? You see, that's a problem. Whenever we see such interesting finds, it's always broken, and you see it's broken here, so the continuation is missing. But it's customary to complete it as follows: to the house of trumpeting, to announce the coming of the Shabbat. Why do we think this is the proper completion of the inscription? Because the Jewish sources, actually both the rabbinical sources and Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian who lived in Jerusalem at the end of the Second Temple period, they both tell us that every Friday when the Shabbat was coming, a priest would be standing on the Temple Mount and blow the trumpet to announce the coming of the Shabbat. That was the practice in Jerusalem also in the 1st century AD, and you can imagine to yourselves the busy streets all around us on a Friday, on a busy Friday, and the Shabbat is approaching. It's almost 5, 6 in the afternoon. Shabbat is coming, and people are starting to go home, and then the priest blows the trumpet. Everyone hears it, and they know that peace has come to the city of peace.